While the Omega Speedmaster Diver itself is an interesting watch, when you make it the 007 edition Bond watch, the result is bound to be a product that's unique, limited and special. A watch to carry the legacy of James Bond. And when a product that is already a success is required to be changed, to not only make it more appealing but also special, there are a lot of factors to consider to ensure that the changes to the aesthetics, design, layout and looks of the product are accepted widely within the buyers or the market. Another factor to consider is to ensure that the changes align with the purpose that the watch stands for, which in this case is the attributes, styling, lifestyle and legacy of James Bond. Omega this time went out to even involve the James Bond of the time, Daniel Craig, into the process of designing the watch to ensure that the design aspects that James Bond himself feels represent the trends and times of 21st century are incorporated into the final execution of the watch. So before a watch is even worn by James Bond or offered to the market, it has the endorsement that triggers the acceptance. As a result, we have a watch that, although is the same Seamaster 300 meters diver professional, it's not the same. The first thing you notice in any watch is the dial, and here the dial is entirely different with all the dial elements redesigned and executed. Starting off with the dial itself, we don't have the signature laser engraved wave pattern like standard steel counterparts. Rather, we have a textured brown dial here, which is anodized aluminum, purposely designed to fade over time. The texture on the dial isn't also just surface treated. Rather, you can see the small grains indented into the dial itself, giving almost a three-dimensional effect. To complement the vintage-looking dial texture, we have tan shade on the hour indices, which is achieved by Fox-edged lume to add further vintage character to the watch. Same is the case with dial hands, and we have in them perfectly matching lume infill. And overall, while we have a brand new watch and the release, the tan indices along with brown granular textured dial have the effect that it almost looks like a watch from the past. This is interesting because although the lume infill is tanned, the lume itself is amazingly futuristic, and we will look at lume shot later in the video. The bezel also maintains the same tone as the dial, and we have textured and anodized bezel made of aluminum. The bezel is treated to be hard to enhance its tolerance to daily use, but it will fade over time to add character to the watch. Another interesting design is the bezel graduations, and the font matches the color scheme of the dial. One big step up here from the standard steel Seamasters is that the bezel is fully lumed, and the sight in the dark here, which we will look at shortly, is indeed a beauty to behold. Another difference is that there is no date in the dial. As a result, while we do have a more symmetrical dial that comes at the cost of the date window, we naturally have a watch that's time only. The watch case comes with dome crystal on top, which has resulted in watch being not just slightly thinner, but also there are reflections from the crystal that maintain a character of their own. And since the watch holistically is vintage inspired, the domed crystal on top marries very well with the watch design. There's a printed arrow just above 6 o'clock hour marker, which traditionally has always been an emblem reserved for equipment issued to the British Army. But here, while it does add a character, it's nothing more than a design inspiration to incite excitement amongst the collectors. The case size here is the same 42mm, but the case material has changed completely to titanium now. Not just the material has changed, but also the case treatment, and here we have fully brushed case at all bevels and faces, as opposed to steel models which have polished beveling at the lugs. There's a meshed bracelet to add further vintage vibe, which is again offered in the same flesh of titanium. The material being titanium works well because it's relatively darker in shade than steel, and since the watch overall is vintage inspired, it makes sense to not just keep it less shiny but also a little understated in appearance too. Thanks to titanium case and the bracelet, the watch is incredibly light and on my scale weighed at only 97 grams. For reference, the steel model with bracelet adjusted to 6.5 inches wrist weighs at 180 grams, which is a substantial weight difference. To picture the size of the watch, I measured the size of watch face at the outer extremity of the bezel, and it came out at 41.89mm, and the size of crystal on top of the dial is 31.34mm. The lug-to-lug height of the watch is 48.54mm, so it's a relatively larger watch. If you wanted to see how does the dial color or size compare with Rolex Submariner, here's a reference shot for you, and you can see how this vintage or great black Seamaster looks compared to glossy black on Submariner. Contrary to steel models, the case back here is closed but comes with interesting engravings, especially if you notice the 007 marking. If you're wondering what does the 62 represent, that's the year when the first Bond film was released. To check the accuracy of the movement, I timed the watch and observed its timekeeping for 24 hours. After 24 hours of observation time, while the watch was stored between vertical and horizontal positions, the watch gained 2 seconds, which is indeed within its specifications. The bezel action or sound is crisp, but the bezel grip is the same as steel models, and unfortunately, it continues to remain poorly executed for bezel operation. You almost have to press the bezel inward and downward to make it to rotate, or else your fingers will simply slip even when they are not wet. Quite possibly, this is one of the hardest bezels to rotate in watches at this price point. Under the macro, the hour hand comes with very clearly defined lines that are not just crisp but also very consistent and detailed. Similar is the case with minute hand, and the treatment and consistency of lines is simply impressive and beautiful, with no signs of imperfections on side. The seconds hand makes no difference here and comes with the same treatment with no issues to be seen. The hour markers took me by surprise and come with stain marks, which to me is definitely not a design character for a vintage inspired watch, rather a flaw. The same surface flaws are consistent at other hour markers too, and you can see the same surface decoloration at 12 o'clock hour marker too. I went out further to check at other hour markers, and the issue is still there. Now, I don't believe it was meant to be there, and given it's a very new watch, I wasn't expecting to see the smudge marks. But if these are really deliberate flaws to add character to a vintage inspired watch, I'm really out. These surface marks don't even require macro lens or loop to show, and you can go back to any clips of this video and you can find them on the watch. The painting for text is crisp, and you can see that the dial itself also maintains consistency. The text for Omega and Seamaster along with Omega logo is also crisp, and there's no flaw to note. Putting the watch in the dark, the lume is absolutely breathtaking. I have to say that I have rarely seen lumes that were this beautiful, and if lume is what floats your boat, you will be blown away with this. While the watch is vintage inspired, the lume is as futuristic as you can imagine, and while all the hour markers, hour hand and bezel graduations are beautifully blue, the minute hand and lume pip is stunningly green. I left the watch in the dark for another 10 minutes, and not that the time was still readable on the watch. The loss of brightness is also very consistent, which is indeed impressive. On my wrist, which is 6.5 inches in size and has the wristband of 55mm, the watch with 42mm case size and lug-to-lug of close to 49mm has a fair bit of wrist presence, and it is not a small watch by any means. The case thickness came out on my caliper at 13.10mm, and overall it does not look very thick due to domed crystal. The meshed bracelet isn't the most flexible to bend, and resultantly it may not contour very close to your wrist, especially if you have smaller wrists. If you see the bracelet at 6 o'clock side of the case, it flares out a little past my wrist, and you can see some airspace between the bracelet and my wrist, which I personally dislike, because if the watch can't sit properly on my wrist, I take it's not for me. The bracelet is relatively rigid, and you can see that there's a limit to its maximum bend, and it simply won't give further to follow your wrist profile if you have smaller wrists. There's a double deploying clasp on offer, and to adjust it is very simple. You simply flip the locking lid back to free the clasp and move it to the bracelet hole to size as per your wrist, and then you lock the flip lid back. Omega Speedmaster 007 edition is indeed a watch which is very different from its standard steel counterparts. We have a titanium case and the bracelet, and then the vintage vibe with fox patina in the form of tanned lumen fill in the hour markers, dial hands and the bezel. There's an aluminum dial and the bezel with granular texture to add further character, and then the case with all brush treatment to ensure that there's virtually no reflections on offer. The bezel lume is superior than the steel counterparts, but the case back is closed, which arguably is a step back from the standard steel models. But is it really worth 2 times the retail price of steel models? I mean, it is a different watch from the steel models, not necessarily better or inferior. So it seems that half the price you pay for this 007 edition is going for the actual watch and half for the name.